And thank you, as always, for joining us. Very much looking forward to hearing our panel and learning a little bit about housing and all the other items that have happened and played out this year. So very excited to learn from our guest speaker today. It's really interesting to be on this call. I think it is probably for all of us. For those of you that participated yesterday, we had our virtual holiday party, which was, again, another experience that no one 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago would have ever thought that we would have been in. And today is our last virtual community meeting of this year. And it feels like it was just launched, a few months ago. So that kind of puts in context how fast this year has gone by and how much has gone on through this year. So some of you have heard some of the things that I'm going to say. You heard them already yesterday, but I just really would like to say them again. 2020 was a highly eventful year. We probably saw the worst of people and processes, and then we also saw some of the best in people and processes. And I do want to point out, obviously, I'm highly biased, to being a teammate of yours at Skid Row Housing Trust, but I believe at the trust we saw the best, in ourselves and in our partners, whether they were outside of the organization, whether they were your teammates, whether they were at HQ, PMC, HSS, DNA, RED, you name it, but we really saw a lot of people, particularly those in the field that work for property management and health and social services, really step up and try to do work that's already difficult and rewarding at the same time become even more difficult and more rewarding during a time like this. So again, kudos to you. Honored to be on the team with you. I do want to point out a couple of great things that happened in 2020. We obviously maintained a high level of housing for those that needed it. Our RED team got approved to build more housing that you're seeing in the lease ups, and you're going to see more next year and the years after that, fighting very hard to make sure that we continue on with our mission. I can't say enough to the people that maybe don't work for Skid Row Housing Trust and you're listening in because you care about the work that we do, but we had frontline in the field employees under property management and case management having to go into, a very tough situation with the pandemic, in Skid Row. So again, want to end the year expressing, gratitude to them for doing what they did. Through these virtual community meetings, we met a lot of people. We had speakers and donors and presenters and panelists that really stepped up and wanted to engage with us. So the partnerships that we created this year is a really positive thing that I think that we're going to take away from it. Fundraising, the development and advancement team, those that actually created the environment for us to connect, at least technologically when we couldn't connect in person, fulfilled a need that we all had to the best of the ability when we lost connection to people in quarantine. So they did a phenomenal job in bringing awareness, and the ability to raise funds for our team members and our residents in the field. So kudos to them. There's a lot of stories that we've shared, and that we're going to continue to share now that we're at the end of the year. There's a lot of quote numbers, that back up the stories that our residents have told, that our panelists have told, and that our employees and team members have told. So we're looking forward to demonstrating and sharing with the outside world everything that you did. So thank you all for starting the virtual community meetings. Thank you all for participating in them, and equally so, thank you for taking the time out, which I cannot believe is our last virtual community meeting of 2020. It's just shocking to me. So on behalf of me and the leadership, our board of directors, our employees, happy holidays. We hope that you enjoy them the way you want to enjoy them heading into the tail end of this year. And again, gratitude to our residents and our team members. With that, I would like to turn it over to Sierra. That will kick off our awesome guest speaker, and she will be conducting this roundtable talk with the gentleman. So here you go, Sierra. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks, Lee.
She had on a Superman t-shirt, cut, and showed a little sack.
Could we get everybody to mute? Thank you. Great. Well, I'd like to introduce Ben Metcalf, who's our guest speaker today, and we're going to be engaging in some good conversation about what's going on in the world and specifically what's going on in the industry, and get his points of view on a couple of things that we're all dealing with right now. So with that, I'll introduce Ben Metcalf, who is the Managing Director of Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley, where he leads both the expansion and deepening of Turner Center's work solving housing affordability challenges through policy, practice, and innovations. Prior to joining Turner Center, Ben was appointed in 2015 by former Governor Jerry Brown to lead California's Department of Housing and Community Development, a role he held till 2019. Prior to joining HCD, Ben worked for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, D.C., including as an appointee of President Obama in the role of Deputy Assistant Secretary overseeing HUD's Office of Multifamily Housing Programs. Before that, he developed mixed income and mixed use communities with California-based Bridge Housing Corporation. Ben is a principal founder of Stronger Foundations, LLC, a housing policy and practice consulting firm. Thank you, Ben, and welcome.
Hi, Sierra. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to join you all this afternoon, and I really appreciate this series that you have put together, bringing folks in to chat with you. A couple of notes. First of all, I'm a big fan of the work you all do. As director of the Department of Housing and Community Development, I had the chance to come down and tour several of your fantastic properties, meet with the team, meet with some of your residents, and I've always felt that Skid Row Housing Trust is sort of the go-to problem solver on the challenge of ending homelessness in the LA region and statewide, and certainly appreciated the thought partnership as the state of California was working to implement various new initiatives towards ending homelessness. And also, not included in your bio, I should mention, my first job out of college actually was working for a developer of permanent supportive housing, a nonprofit that at the time was called Common Ground Community out in New York. Helped first sort of got the itch for doing this work by working in the permanent supportive housing space. So thanks for having me.
No, welcome. So we have a couple of questions we want to just talk through, more of a conversation. As the Managing Director of Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley, can you talk about the work that center advances and your role there?
Yeah, happy to. So there are a number of what I would call sort of housing policy think tanks and research centers all around the country. Some of these are sponsored by academic institutions. Some are structured as nonprofits. I think what makes the Turner Center particularly unique and particularly relevant is both the comprehensiveness of our perspective. We're really looking at the full gamut of housing issues that are making the affordable housing challenge so pronounced, both here in California and nationally. But in particular, I think we have really brought to the conversation nationally and in California a real perspective that's driven by the reality of California story, of sort of a housing condition that is really impacted by what we've seen to be an incredible shortage of new housing getting built at serving all ends of the income spectrum. It's a story that I think is actually doesn't resonate as loudly as it ought to, particularly outside of California. And then I would say that our research center is somewhat exceptional in the fact that we not only do the highest quality housing research and policy recommendations, but that the team here are folks who although they are steeped in academia, also come from a professional background. So all of our leadership team, our research and policy leadership, all have worked outside of academia. We have all held positions in government. We have all worked in practice. And so we are really focused on doing relevant, timely policy solutions and research recommendations that can help move the needle in Sacramento, in Washington, D.C. on the issues and policies that we care about.
That's great.
And then managing director, I just say, we have a team of about a dozen full-time folks, and then a similar number of part-time graduate student researchers, part-time fellows, and other consultant support. So, my job as managing director is to manage all the hurdle those cats in our team, keep us all working to do that really important work, and then to also be a liaison out to the housing advocacy community and to other research and policy organizations around the country.
Great. Previously, you spent 6 years working at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, appointed by President Obama. What was that like, and what accomplishments are you most proud of?
Yeah, so I was there for, I guess, 6 of the 8 Obama years, if you will. So I missed the first year, and I left to go join the state of California with 1 year still on the clock. But it was a really awesome stretch to be at HUD. When I landed, not only did I join at HUD, a really exceptional team there at HUD, great committed group of very talented thought leaders, practitioners who had come into HUD, supported by the exceptional career staff who was there. But it was also at a moment where HUD was taking on exceptionally large new responsibilities coming out of the last recession, the Great Recession. There were a number of major stimulus programs and a real opportunity for innovation and flexibility in that period from about 2009, 2010. And so I had the opportunity to work on implementing a couple signature efforts that are still with us today. So I was very involved in the launch of the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, which provides stimulus funds to owners of public housing and multifamily assisted housing to do comprehensive transformative projects. I was very involved in the Section 202 and Section 811 programs, really revamping and updating them. Those are permanent supportive housing programs by the federal government for elderly and disabled individuals, respectively. Interestingly, over the arc of my 6 years, the politics changed quite significantly. And so in the 2010 elections coming in 2011, there was a Congress and a House in particular that was very, in many ways, anti-government expenditures, very focused on ratcheting back the federal footprint. And so went quickly from this period where HUD was being tasked to do a lot of bold and ambitious new stuff to a period where we were asked to do all that same work, but with fewer resources, fewer staff, and to try and find efficiencies. And I actually spent the balance of my time at HUD, sort of the later years, in administration. So I ran the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs, worked on actually consolidating some 53 odd offices down to a core number of 18 locations, helped to retrain all of we had something like 1,500 staff scattered around the country, migrated every single one of them to a new position responsibility and set of new trainings to try and figure out ways we could do our core business a little bit more effectively and efficiently. And focused a lot on just increasing the impact and relevance of the federally insured lending program that HUD operates. Some of you may have heard of, for example, the 221D4, the 223F, the state risk share programs. Those are under my purview and really had been very clunky and were due, I think, for getting in under the engine and figuring out ways that we could process those applications better, have them align better with affordable housing projects and programs. And also got very involved with the rental assistance demonstration, which was an effort to bring the public housing inventory sort of back into the mainstream, make it easier for public housing authorities to access conventional debt, easier for them to access conventional tax credit equity, and really leverage that sort of mainstream housing finance system to make that public housing up to date and rehabbed and often situated back into mixed income communities. So that, in my mind, a lot of that was sort of like just good governance work that didn't need a lot of new budget, but was incredibly important, and which has had a lasting and durable legacy. Even today, after the Trump administration, you still see the rental assistance demonstration and the multifamily lending programs still really delivering on those goals.
I actually remember working on the for-profit side when a lot of that was going on, and seeing some of the offices close and get more efficient, and wondering what was going on. But I remember shortly after that working with some of the loan restructures that you just mentioned, the 223D and F, and really working through those programs and seeing how effective they were. And I thank you for that work, because it really made a big difference. It meant, closing some of those loans that would take, 120 to 180 days sometimes to get through the HUD process, and just, left them off the table for a lot of developers. And so really seeing those streamlined, it opened the doors to create more housing. That was definitely needed.
And oddly, I mean, the crazy thing about it was, it's those lending programs that HUD was running. I mean, they're massive programs. I mean, they do, they might do $15 billion of new originations in a given year. An amazingly small percentage of that federally insured multifamily lending was actually going towards properties that were using low-income housing tax credits. And so one of the big insights that I had early on was, this is crazy. Like, why do we have the federal government on the one hand, subsidizing tax credit equity, on the other hand, subsidizing federally insured lending, but the twain never seemed to meet? It was very hard to bring those regulations together and to really make the underwriting align with what affordable housing developers actually needed and wanted. And so I think one of the things that I'm most proud of with the lending side is actually that it's vastly easier now as an affordable housing developer using tax credits to access this incredibly competitive and cheap debt that the federal government makes available. It's probably less of an issue for Skid Row and folks in LA, because of course you have these very Community Reinvestment Act motivated depository institutions like JP Morgan and Wells who are providing alternative products. But at a moment like the last 6 months, where a lot of those big banks have gotten a little twitchy and their underwriting has ratcheted up, having FHA available, I think, is a good reminder of, it's a good reminder of why FHA is important, certainly in the COVID moment.
Yeah, it's definitely opened doors for other developers and for Skid Row Housing Trust as well. It is something that we're keeping on the table to look at our projects in the future. So I, again, thank you for that work. All right. Previously, actually, you transitioned to working for California Department of Housing Community Development. How did your objectives change in the shift from national perspective to a state perspective?
Yeah, I mean, when I came over to HCD to run the state housing department, I mean, I will confess it was a pretty sleepy department at the time. It had not housing had not been a major focus of then Governor Jerry Brown. Of course, the state had gone through these brutal cuts of its own during the Depression, and so it was a little bit of a backwater feel to it. But at the same time, there was a lot of energy building as we were rolling into 2016 from the advocacy community to do another major affordable housing bond. A lot of energy around creating a permanent housing source. And so, I was very motivated to join the state because I thought I could really help unlock a lot of new money for subsidized housing at a time where costs were going up and subsidy sources were scarce. I'd say, interestingly for me, one of the things that I quickly realized when I landed at HCD was, first of all, how challenged, how the extent to which the affordability crisis in California was really being driven not by a lack of supply, but by a lack of subsidy, but really by a lack of new supply. I mean, we've had this crazy condition in California for the last couple of decades, where a fraction of the new entry-level, accessible, workforce product, the stuff that used to get built all the time in the 60s and 70s, where you had wood frame walk-up multi, no subsidy going into it, but you had developers who could just bang out multifamily product and not, price it at $3,000 a month. That just wasn't happening in California. And part of the reason the affordable housing crisis had gotten so bad here was because folks who a few decades ago would never have needed a subsidized apartment were now competing with those who always would, right?
Yeah.
And so my focus shifted a lot in 2016 and 2017 to this challenge of how do we get communities to be more welcoming of all kinds of housing, and how do we really spur the marketplace to build the kind of product that will lessen the pressure on our affordable housing developers and our constrained subsidy sources. And so a lot of my time in 2017, 2018, even into 2019 was not just on effectively administering those subsidy sources like the bond program that and No Place Like Home, which of course we got to the voters and implemented, but also trying to push cities to liberalize their zoning a little bit, to make it, to make more sites zoned for multifamily housing, to make it harder for cities also to block projects that they didn't like. Think of the work around the buy right work on Senate Bill 35, where we were basically trying to say, in what seems like a very simple statement, like, hey, city of X, if you have come up with a locally approved zoning designation that says you want multifamily housing in this part of town, like, let it go forward. Don't subject it to a second round of discretionary reviews. Just let your planning staff, size it up against the planning framework you put in place and either give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Either it should meet the criteria or it doesn't meet the criteria, but let's not subject it to a protracted series of discretionary discussions among politically influenced, planning commissioners, city councilors, and a whole nother round of environmental review. Let's get rid of the environmental review. Let's make this ministerial. And then, by the way, let's actually use this. I mean, California is really lucky. I mean, California is super lucky to have the housing element and the regional housing needs allocation process. And I was a RENA skeptic when I came to the state as a former affordable housing developer. I'd seen it just as a sort of a planning process that went on the shelf. Having spent now 4 years at the state and seeing the changes that we were able to make to it to give it some more teeth, I'm a real RENA convert. I actually really do think this is one of the most exciting things going on in California right now, is that all of these local governments are having to get super creative about where to upzone, where to find new sites, how to retool their housing programs so that they can go back and say to the state with a straight face, yes, we have a plan to build our 3,000 low-income units and 6,000 market above moderate units, and here's how we're going to do it.
Awesome. So you've worked, and you touched a little bit on this, you've worked in the housing space for nearly 20 years. What changes and trends have you noticed in the housing crisis over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them is what I just alluded to a few minutes ago, which is that the housing crisis has gotten worse, not better. It impacts a greater swath of families who and sort of migrated up the income ladder. I think we see, one of the in the sort of homelessness space. I think one of the most painful things for me, and we've been seeing this in LA, is even as we've gotten so much better at our game of building permanent supportive housing, deploying effective evidence-based solutions that really do get people permanently out of homelessness. Sort of the valve that's been pouring people onto the streets just is getting opened more and more, even as we're getting better and better at solving the problem. So there are like massive structural issues there that, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, but I certainly put, one of the culprits is just the fact that we have not been keeping up with building enough housing overall across the board. And then I think the other culprit has been, over time, a real diminishment in the funding that's been available for housing. And I think, sometimes we can get distracted by these eye-popping numbers. Well, geez, there's a $25 billion stimulus that's about to get, rental assistance that's about to get made available by the Congress potentially in the next couple of days. Well, that's a big number. It's a huge number. But if you think about the fact that, $75 billion, by the end of the year, we expect tenants in America to have accumulated $75 billion of arrearages, like, you're solving maybe a third of this temporary problem, and you're not actually fixing the structural problem. Like, so and then all these great federal initiatives that we've put in place over the last few decades, whether it's the voucher program, whether it's the tax credit program, whether it's home block grants, again, they seem like big numbers, but when you put them in inflation adjusted dollars and before what we're dealing with in this crisis is going on,
And I think in California, especially, that it's something that we have to solve things on the front end and not just worry about the back end. We call it kind of an arch of homelessness, right? It's Skid Row Housing Trust has traditionally dealt with homelessness after somebody's been chronically homeless for several years, and then they need to be lifted back up. And if we look at it from the front end of things, how do we solve people from never becoming homelessness? Those are structural issues that we really have to look at as a group, right? And how do we solve for that so that no one ever has to experience what some of our residents have had to go through to get housed at some point in time? So it's all important work. What do you believe are the short-term and kind of long-term solutions that are needed to address the crisis?
Sierra, well, let me just actually maybe I can answer that question by answering the previous question. I mean, one of the things that does give me a little bit of hope is I think we have, as maybe a housing advocacy community or as policymakers, become a little bit more attuned to the sort of intersectionality of all of it too. I mean, as the housing crisis has become more pronounced, I think it's forced a reckoning in terms of the ways that that has an interference effect with our ability to achieve our climate goals, to actually address, public health issues. I mean, there's, just to give one painful example of it, I mean, there's been some amazing academic work over the last couple of months looking at, the increased tendency of folks to increase mortality rates from COVID in places that have not had eviction moratoria in place, right? Like it's pretty clear that when you don't provide housing stability, bad health outcomes hit you. It's pretty clear when you don't address, when you don't allow, housing to get built in our, infill city locations, that folks are either going to, in case of California, they're going to migrate to the suburbs of Austin or the suburbs of Las Vegas or the Inland Empire, right? Like those have very negative climate consequences, and it's very hard for us to ignore them. So those are very negative things, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there's an increased visibility to them that's forcing kinds of conversations that I think are going to be really promising, ways in which we can do a lot better of saying, hey, we need to solve the climate problem, and we're going to do it by not just making our buildings more energy efficient. That's fine, but really fundamentally trying to move the needle on basic land use development patterns. I mean, that's where the GHG savings really lie. Similarly, great that we are distributing all these vaccines, great that we're making all this progress, but if we really want to not be in this situation again the next time a pandemic strikes, God forbid, how about we actually have Section 8 vouchers as an entitlement, as actually President-elect Biden has proposed? Like that would actually mean we wouldn't have to scramble and come up with these sort of half measures of temporary rental assistance, and we could actually make sure that stable housing is allowing families who would otherwise be impacted in these kinds of moments and getting exposed to public health issues or great research, great findings, of course, on educational outcomes for kids in moments of instability too. I mean, all these things connect together, and I think they shine an ever greater spotlight on the need for us to do things differently in the housing space that I think can and should be motivating to our policymakers at local, state, and federal levels.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about, also like the stopping people from entering homelessness, you also have to, acknowledge racial inequalities as well on that list to really drive that home, because you need to be able to push up home ownership for people so that we never have people actually fall into that homelessness and that kind of missing middle piece as well.
Yeah, and I have one of the most amazing things of the last couple of years has really been the increased visibility with mainstream press, with sort of at the practitioner level, into the fundamentally racist history of our local, state, and federal policies that have set us up to perpetuate patterns of racial inequality and inhibit wealth building in ways that are unequal. I mean, I give credit to one of my colleagues at Berkeley, Richard Rothstein, wrote Color of Law, and a whole host of other folks who have been really pushing in the mainstream to draw attention to the fact that the things like historically restrictive racial covenants, redlining in our FHA lending, zoning practices that local governments put in place to require single-family zoning, these very much had racist origins. They very much have had inequitable outcomes by race to particularly Black Americans. And we are still living in those worlds that these policies have made. And if we don't act to disentangle this and peel some of them back, we are going to continue to see trend lines going in the wrong direction. That's not new news to many people, but I think it's something that in a very promising way has sort of entered the dialogue in a more visible and mainstream way in the last couple of years, which gives me hope.
I too have hope. How has COVID impacted the affordable housing crisis, and what do you think are the long-term implications? You touched on a lot of this too, right? It's housing should be a right, and if we make sure that people are housed, then they're going to stay healthy. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I am very grateful that things are not worse than they are, and I really want to commend. At the federal level, the Centers for Disease Control, they very critically put a moratorium out on evictions nationally. I want to give credit to our legislative leadership, Governor Newsom. They passed Assembly Bill 3088 over the summer, which is much better than the national statewide moratorium. Obviously, local leaders as well stepped up to really prevent evictions from being much more pronounced than I think we feared they might have been. At the end of the day, the crisis that we're in today is a crisis that is not evenly felt. From a housing perspective, it is overwhelmingly being felt by renters. It is overwhelmingly being felt by renters who are already in vulnerable economic conditions because of the tendency to have jobs that have been particularly impacted by the crisis. And it is overwhelmingly felt by people who are more likely to be exposed and or at risk of both receiving COVID and morbidity once they contract it. And so we have a community of folks of renters who luckily have not been subjected to eviction, but are poised to really come out of this in a way that sets them back long terms. And I mentioned before an estimate of perhaps $75 billion of total arrearages that may accumulate over the course of the pandemic. But I mean, if where we get to at the end of this is we all breathe a sigh of relief that folks didn't get evicted, but folks are still walking away with massive new debt attached to them, on top of likely medical debt, likely student debt, likely car debt, then we have just basically said to a whole cohort of lower income Americans who are, by the way, disproportionately Black, Latinx, that not only did we ask you to stay home and shelter in place, not only were you the ones more likely to get furloughed to help this public health crisis, but you are going to come out of this even farther behind, even less likely to be able to move up the economic ladder because of that accumulation of debt. Again, there is a bill in Congress that I think is helpful. I think it will partially assist some of those folks in removing some of that debt load, but it's a half measure at best. I'd say the other concern that I have going forward is also, folks often forget or aren't aware that even in California, something like half of all renters reside in smaller multifamily properties. So maybe it's a rented single family home, maybe it's a duplex or an 8-unit building. The majority of those structures are not owned by institutional owners. The majority of them are owned by mom and pops. They may not even hold those assets through an LLC. They may hold it under their own name. Many of them, particularly in the LA basin, are themselves communities of color. They're first-generation immigrants. And for a lot of them, this is their primary source of income. And so if we're looking at a scenario where this eviction moratorium continues to go on and the COVID crisis continues to extend, at least through the summer, I do think we're going to see a whole wave of these guys giving up and selling their properties. And I worry that means that a lot of these properties will migrate into the hands of Wall Street investors and professional companies that will be much more aggressively looking to convert this often naturally affordable housing stock into more expensive and less affordable housing stock. And so in one swoop, both removing that wealth building opportunity for a lot of folks for whom this asset might have otherwise helped them move up and out. And on the other hand, making the rental crisis that much more pronounced for folks who are already on the edge.
Yeah, I would have to agree that that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think you're on.
Oh,
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think that's a very good point
Yeah.
that a lot of people are probably not really recognizing. And it is one that will have a greater impact over time, and one that we might not see, in a lot of the numbers, but it's definitely going to be felt by a lot of people out there. All right, last question. Come January, we'll have a new president and a new Congress and reconfigure legislative bodies throughout the nation. How do you view the election outcomes nationally, and what do you expect for California and Los Angeles? It's a loaded question there.
Yeah.
Get out your crystal ball.
Yeah. I think there's two ways I can answer this. So should I start with do you want the half full or the half empty to start?
You pick.
I'll go half full. Half full to start. So half full is, a majority, a strong and compelling majority of Americans elected a president and vice president who ran on a ticket that put housing, that put forward, I think, the most ambitious housing agenda that we've probably seen in at least a generation. I mean, I think you have to go back practically to Lyndon Johnson to see somebody who really ran on a campaign as exciting as it relates to housing as this president did, as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris did. I mentioned the fact that they're proposing a universal entitlement to a housing voucher, which would be on its own transformational. But it's not just that, right? If you go and look at their program, you see a whole list of really exciting reforms, particularly on other subsidy sources as well. Reforms to the tax credit program, reforms to the housing trust fund, but also tackling some of this intersectionality stuff that I talked about. Really recognizing, I think, about the interconnectedness of homelessness. Really, signaling and sending the message that they want to lift up the work of the United States Interagency Council and really much more aggressively put forward a comprehensive plan to ending homelessness and have the federal government lead on that. Also, at least signaling they're willing to poke a few sacred cows on the zoning front. You can go and read in black and white. They're saying, hey, we need to condition some of the block grant funding that we put out there on local governments not being hostile to affordable housing, on having some degree of inclusionary zoning. That's a really big deal, right? So there's a really wonderful and ambitious legislative agenda. I think with Biden and Harris, we have very capable leaders. I think we're already seeing them pulling into their orbit a lot of very accomplished and seasoned professionals. I had a chance to listen this morning to some remarks by Representative Fudge, the nominee for HUD. She doesn't have a housing background, but I think she might be a fantastic leader and be very helpful in sort of re-energizing the staff at HUD and helping implement whatever's coming down the pike. So that's my half full take. The half empty is I think it's going to be really hard to get things done in any kind of reasonable time frame. I think, first of all, going into HUD today, you're going to find a staff that's pretty demoralized, that's been working where you've had a lot of brain drain, you've had a lot of career staff have left over the last few years, you've had a lot of stuff that I worked on when I was at the Obama administration much of it has been reversed or sidelined. I think about the affirmative furthering fair housing rule, a lot of these regulatory a lot of this regulatory agenda that have been put in place by Obama was shut down under Trump. That'll need to get revisited and lifted back up. So you have the machinery of government will need to sort of get restarted, and that'll take time for anybody coming in. Second of all, it's going to be a divided Congress. The Democrats have the slimmest majority in the House that any party has had in modern history. The Senate hangs in the balance of the race in Georgia, but in all likelihood, it will be very much divided. And so I don't think there's going to be an easy way for this administration to get this Congress to enact the very ambitious set of reforms that have been proposed. I also think there's a lot of competing pressures on other things that are going to need this president to put his scarce political capital on, not least of which is COVID recovery and climate. Now, can't do some of those things have a housing nexus? Is there a way to sort of backdoor some housing priorities through the budget process, through another COVID recovery bill? Well, absolutely there is, but I don't think it's wise for all of us to assume that the world is going to look, massively different in terms of the feds coming to the rescue in the next year or two. I think that team is going to be getting in there, doing good work, and I suspect we're going to see some incremental progress in a handful of different federal programs. But unfortunately, I don't think we're set up right now for the kind of transformational change that I think many of us would love to see coming out of the federal government in the short term.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think that the key word is we need to be patient, right? They're going to be new in their job. They're going to have a heavy agenda, and then I think that all of us, while we need things now, it's going to be key to just have some patience and to just kind of trust in the process and let them do their work.
Yeah, and I'd just say, there's been a lot in the news about this another round of stimulus, and again, it's I feel bad for the Democrats being forced to take this deal because it's a much smaller deal than what the House had put forward over the summer. It's less than $1 billion in stimulus. The House leadership have been looking for, I think it was closer to $3 billion, but this is really the best they could do. It also sheds support for state and local governments, which really should have been a part of this deal, and has gotten left out for political reasons. I don't know what's going to happen in city governments. I don't know what's going to happen in state governments, but there's going to be a lot of layoffs with this money not there. And then we've heard McConnell basically say, okay, fine, you're twisting my arm. I'll give you this $1 billion, but there's no leverage on him to do this again next year now, right? So the Democrats are basically got really sort of jammed here. They had to take a really crummy deal because Americans are suffering out there, and so they're moving forward this relief package, but it's going to really compromise their ability to get something bigger come January. So I don't blame them, but it's a sad reality of this very divided political environment in Washington right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been enlightening, enjoyable. I look forward to see what your group is going to put forth. It sounds like you have some great minds in there that are going to work together to come up with some solutions. And we definitely need some policy solutions and some leadership on that side. So I'm really excited to see what you guys turn out.
Yeah, and just a plug to everybody here, please do stay connected to the Turner Center. It does have an email listserv where you can stay abreast of our research. We have a Twitter account that's pretty active too. We have a paper we're going to be releasing in the next few days on the opportunities for reusing commercial lands here in California. We see that as a huge opportunity to get more housing built. And we will be putting out commentary on the federal policy side too. So stay tuned in the next couple of weeks. Stay tuned for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Erica, I think we're ready for the
Hi,
next
everybody.
slide.
Hi, Sierra. That was fantastic. I want to thank you and Ben. That was such an engaging and interesting conversation, and I think a really powerful way to end the 2020 season of our virtual community series. That was just wonderful listening to the two of you and having an opportunity to think about things in a somewhat broader context. And I'd like to also echo what Lee said at the beginning and wish everybody the very happiest of holidays. I will be moderating the Q&A, so if you have questions for Sierra or Ben, please type them in the chat. But first, I'd like to make sure everybody knows, I'm sure many of you do, we're in the last couple of weeks of our year-end Do Something to End Homelessness campaign. We have set a goal of $200,000, and we need your help to bring it across the finish line. All of the proceeds of this campaign will support current and future residents of Skid Row Housing Trust to lead safe, stable lives and wellness. And we just can't do this without the generosity of everybody in our community and network. And please visit the campaign page and do what you can. We'd also love your help sharing it with your friends and family. And so with that, I would love to entertain any questions. Aha. Could we go back to the take action slide since we don't have questions in the chat? So in order to support the trust, we always want to give people plenty of opportunities. These buttons on your screen are live, and you can make a gift directly to the campaign. You can create a fundraiser, and this is a DIY campaign. There are a lot of terrific examples and fun opportunities. People have really personalized this. You could create or join a team, and we always want for people to join our mailing list. So thank you so much for that. And with that, I'd like to go to questions in the Q&A. Ina, yes, you can definitely go to the Turner Center for Housing Innovations website and sign up for their mailing list and listserv. And then we will also include links to the paper that Ben referred in our newsletter and follow up. We always have an article about the virtual community meeting. Are there any other questions for Sierra or Ben before we wrap up today? Sorry about this, you guys. My notifications are making this difficult to read. Adriana's question is for Ben, and she is asking regarding the AFFH rule. The Trump administration claims this rule destroys the suburbs. What do you say to someone who uses that as an argument against affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a longer conversation that we probably have time to get into. The simple answer is that the affirmative furthering fair housing rule only obligates local governments to consider issues of racial segregation and concentrated poverty in their formulation of plans for how they intend to spend their affordable housing dollars from home and CDBG and whatnot. It does not actually tell them specifically, what they should and shouldn't do in terms of, say, desegregation or integrating communities or what have you. It simply obligates them to consider this as a factor and makes available to them a bunch of data sources to help inform that policy making and decision making. I think there's a larger conversation, which I think, the Trump administration just sort of it was incoherent ultimately in kind of its position on this. I think Trump himself used this as a political wedge issue that in a way that was really uninformed and reprehensible. America's suburbs today are actually quite diverse to start with. They're actually the majority of the growth that we've seen among non-white folks has actually occurred in America's suburbs. And I do think we do need to put. I mean, actually, the President-elect Biden is correct that in some cases there are probably some suburbs that do need to have pressure put on them by the federal government to not have fully exclusionary, single-family only zoning. I think there is a clear through line to that as a intentionally racist practice that was intended to exclude people based on race, and that is illegal under the existing Fair Housing Act. So, part of it is we do need to enforce the Fair Housing Act. We do have a moral obligation to ensure that our communities are inclusive and welcoming. The affirmatively fair housing rule should be a means to help achieve that. But ultimately, it itself is not telling communities what to do, and it itself is certainly not destroying suburbs in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Ben, for that. Are there any other questions that we'd like to advance for Ben while we have him here with us, or for Sierra prior to wrapping up? Okay, well, with that, Ben, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. You were such a wonderful guest, and it was an absolute pleasure to have you here, and we're really looking forward to remaining connected to you and to the Turner Center, and hopefully you'll get to come back when we're allowing non-essential visitors for another tour.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a happy holidays. Stay safe.
Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.
All right.